Welcome to the Living in Alignment podcast. My name is Amy Landry. Through a collage of conversations, here we distill mindful living and timeless wisdom within a modern, everyday context. Thank you for being here. Harshvardhan Jhaveri is a yoga researcher from Kaivalyadhama Yoga Institute, India. He has co-founded the Yoga Education Collective with Eddie Stern and Robert Moses, and is dedicated to preserving and teaching classical yoga practices and philosophies in an increasingly modernized world. His mission is to live and enhance the awakening of the spiritual message of yoga. Harsh is a member of the Ad-hoc Board of Studies for Yoga in H.S.N.C University in Mumbai. He loves to swim and explore the depths of breath in nature, be it in the mountains or the ocean. A cascadence of mighty peace is the greatest takeaway experienced by all his students. Harsh, welcome to the podcast. It is such a pleasure to chat with you yet again. Thank you for the time. Welcome.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here.
I personally, and hopefully those tuning in as well, would love to hear a little bit about your personal path, particularly as it pertains to, I suppose, yoga. And given that you are from India, live in India, I would love to know how, yoga, I guess it depends on how you perceive yoga, but yoga in some way is intrinsically woven through daily life in India. So yes, please enlighten us as to your path, and as a scholar, practitioner, and teacher as well, would love to know.
Of course. So I'd like to maybe first start by saying that I'm very grateful to my parents, specifically my mother also, who brought me up in this environment. I would say that she was the one who actually initiated me into yogic practices and into mantra, and just through storytelling from various stories from the Vedas, the Puranas, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. And that was actually my entry point into these teachings and into this culture. So it was at home where I began to, get this, get into the fabric of the culture, as you would say. And I think from that early stage, I began to have some yogic practices that she would teach me as well. Just simple breathing exercises, just reconnecting with the breath, inhaling, exhaling, one, inhaling, exhaling, two. And it started off there from my memory that I can remember, just learning Surya Namaskar. And of course, over time, these practices continued more or less. I came back to them much later in my life, actually, when I was in the 11th and 12th grade, when my mother saw me get anxious before exams and before prelims and, the final exams. And she would just tell me in the mornings, just, okay, no need to study anymore. Just wake up in the morning, do 12 rounds of Surya Namaskar, lie down for some time and go give your exam. Like everything that you needed to study and remember is done. Just need to do this now. And then that practice actually after the exams continued with me. So I really enjoyed doing that. And I started going for like yoga lessons with her, with my father, with my brother. We would go as it is, in the city, busy times, 3 times a week, going for the classes. At the same time, through a friend's grandfather, I got introduced into the Chinmaya mission, and I began to study Vedanta, Advait Vedanta of Shankaracharya. And I found some very deep questions being asked there by the Swami, the lead Swami at the time. And he said, we must dwell on these questions. And he asked, why are we here? What are we doing? Why was I born in this country? And these questions led me to then think much more deeply about what was the essence of being here. And from those contemplations, I began to recognize that yoga is such a grammar to this country, and to be able to learn this art, this science, and it's something that I saw that I'm going to do for the rest of my life. So I then decided, okay, I want to study this. I want to learn more about this. And that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to go to a yoga center, yoga institute, and immerse myself in this tradition, in this. And that's how I came to Kaivalyadham. And then I began my formal study in yoga education from there.
Very interesting and such a blessing. And certainly a gift to the world, as you, I guess, highlighted in some sense that you have this blessing to access the yogic teachings and wisdom and Indic traditions, and that is a gift to the world as well. And yeah, an immense blessing that you've been able to walk this path thus far. And no doubt you are an absolute wealth of insight. I very much appreciate the content that you put online, and I really feel like in some way you're very much a bridge. You're quite worldly. You have a very worldly audience. You've traveled a lot around the world, and so you're able to translate this, but yet retain so much of the nectar and the essence of yoga without the dilution and the oversimplification that we often see and experience in the West. And I know that your recent talk on the Teach Yoga Summit that I hosted was so well received, this generous insight into pranava or om. And so today we are going to speak a little bit about pranayama and delve into that in I guess, a practical sense, but also look at the source, the teachings, the more subtleties of pranayama. So I would love to start, if we could really speak to the meaning of pranayama, and specifically highlighting that it does vary across differing texts or through the shastra and across different traditions. So could you please illuminate that a little bit? Because I don't think there's one thing that pranayama is. It depends, like I think almost everything in yoga. So context is everything, of course, and the text. So please, yeah, share with us your thoughts.
Of course, I love this topic actually. Prana is something that's the closest to each one of us, you know. The Tantras describe prana as the emanation or the first transformation of samvid. So the Tantras say, Prak samvit prane parinata. So in the beginning, that was just samvit shakti. There was just pure consciousness, pure awareness. And from that pure consciousness, the first evolute or the first transformation is prana. And everything in this world is made up of prana. So prana is the closest to coming back to our true nature as pure consciousness. So therefore, the role of pranic practices, or we can say pranayam, becomes so vital to return to our true nature. In this sense, everything in the universe is made up of prana. And this prana is already expanded. It's expanded to its maximum expansion, to its highest degree. So in the context of pranayam, ayam is usually defined as the expansion of prana. But truly, it is not just the expansion, but it is the enhancement. Because we say right now, prana is already expanded. So it is only about enhancing the awareness of this expansion. Or maybe what it means by expansion is its expansion in us as a jiva. So we are all pranis, as they say as well. Anything that contains prana is known as a prani or a jivi also. So us humans or insects, any kinds of beings are all pranis. So that brings us also to a very common ground. Prana is, as we said, the first transformation. So it is the closest. And in that sense, it is also sometimes described as the beloved. And this is very much common in Hindi language as well. Are aap to mere pran ho. Like you tell your wife or you tell your child, you are my prana. Means you're my closest one, you are my jaan, or you are my love in that sense. So prana is in that context love, or the transmission of love. So if we look at it from this angle as well, pranayam becomes the expansion of love, or it becomes enhancing the quality of love in our life. So of course, there's a whole gamut of pranic awareness that we can go into. We're going to focus a little bit more on the yogic context here as well. and understand it from the level of the Pranamaya Kosha. So this is particularly to the individual now, and we have what is known as the Pranamaya Kosha, and that is the pranic sheath that is just underneath, or we can say just above or just around the Annamaya Kosha, the physical body. So the physical body is something that we can see, that we can touch, we have a sense of. But the pranic body is something that we can feel, but we cannot particularly have the ability to see. One can develop the ability to see it, but it might take some time or take some practices. So pranamaya kosha is, maybe one could also translate it to as, or would see it as, an auric body, part of it. In this pranamaya kosha, what is exactly prana? Prana is, actually there are 5 pranas. They're all known as prana, but they each have a function. So it is the movement or the functioning of these 5 pranas in an individual that makes up the pranamaya kosha. And the texts give us the locations and the functions of these pranas as well. So we first have Hridi Pranaha. The location of the first prana is also called prana, and its location is the heart. Gude Apanaha. That is, in the Guda, that is the anus, we have the Apana Vayu. And it is also sometimes described as from the anus down to the feet. The prana is described from the chest or the heart towards the mouth or to the neck area. Then comes Nabhi Samanaha. So in the Nabhi, that is in the navel region, we have Samana Vayu. So we're just listing them and then we'll go into each one of them. Then we have Kantha Deshat. In the Kantha, that is in the throat, we have Udana Vayu. And finally, Sarva Shariragaha, all over the body, is Vyana Vayu. So these are the Pancha Vayus or the Pancha Pranas, also sometimes referred to as the Mahapranas, the great pranas. But truly, they're all just one prana having 5 different functions. Their locations are also, it's like where are they housed? But it's not only limited to that. We can also think of it as these 5 pranas are there in every cell of the body. Their functions are in every cell of the body. So what is the function of prana? The function of prana is respiration. Or we can also say receiving, the intake. So inhaling is also sometimes referred to as prana. Then apana is the letting go of, or the excretion, or we can say the movement out. That is apana vayu. So it's, if we think of it in terms of a more mental sense, then it becomes letting go of thoughts, letting go of the breath. What is the function behind that? Apana vayu is functioning in that manner to let go or to remove. Then comes samana. Samana is situated in the navel, associated with digestion. So we eat food, and then we don't need to actually sit and think about it so much about digestion. It happens on its own. So what is responsible for this? The Agni, that Jatara Agni, that Samana Vayu that's associated with it, digests the food for us. So that not just the food, this is one example, but are we able to digest thoughts, digest ideas? That digestion that takes place on a more subtler level is also thanks to Samana Vayu. Then comes Udana Vayu. Udana Vayu is situated in the throat, responsible for communication. This particular Vayu has a special place in yogic context as well, because this is the Vayu associated with the spiritual upliftment or the spiritual awareness as well. The movement from the throat towards the top or the crown of the head. That is responsible. The Udan Vayu is responsible for that. That's the function. And then finally, we have Sarva Shariragaha, all over the body, Vyana Vayu. So Vyana is responsible for, we can think of it as the movement of blood and nutrients and water and, the subtler prana all over the body. So Vyana is responsible for the transmission of the nutrients and everything that's digested and, felt inside the body from the previous pranas as well. And these 5 pranas then whole one cohesive prana. And through pranayam, we are then building upon all these pranas. We are then cultivating an awareness of these pranas, strengthening them, conditioning them so that they can perform their functions better. So here we have a short understanding of prana in the context of yoga and what we are doing through pranayam. One more idea before we move on to the next part is, where does this prana come from? And of course, we described it as it emerges from consciousness, pure consciousness. But while we are embodied here, where do we receive our prana from? And the first source of prana is the sun. Surya becomes our first source of prana. So we can say we are, in some contexts, we are solar beings. Without the sun, there would be no life on earth, that we would not be present. So therefore, the sun becomes the vital source of prana. The sun's rays, the sunlight, then falls on the earth. And the earth then becomes our second source of prana, bhumi prana. So the importance of, being grounded or earthing, as they call it today, is really surging, and walking barefoot, etc. Why? Because we receive pranic flow from the earth. So that is our second source of prana. Our third source of prana then is air. Imagine, just think about it, right? The sunlight falling on the earth, or sunlight or heat and light energy from the sun comes on an object, and that object heats up. What would it release? It would become exothermic in some manner. It would release some air. So the air then becomes our third source of prana. And this is what we usually are working with in the yogic context, this third source of prana, air. Then after that comes water. Water becomes our fourth source of prana. When we have a sip of water, we feel refreshed, we feel energized again. That is a source of prana. And finally, the last or the fifth source is food. Food also, be it herbs or be it, some vegetables, fruits. Also, those plants first receive their prana from sunlight, from the earth, from the air, from water, and then it becomes its own living being, its own prani it is. And then we consume that, and then we receive the prana from that. So food becomes our final source of prana. We can live without food for a few days, maybe longer. People live really long without food. We can live without water also for some time, but without air, it's not possible. Without the earth, without the sun, it's not possible. So these later sources of prana are still very much manageable, but the first is very core to us. So in pranayam, of course, we are working primarily with the third source of prana, that is air. But if we want to expand the relevance or expand the awareness, pranayam can simply mean sitting in the sun. Pranayam can simply mean walking on the earth barefoot. And in this way, expanding our awareness and enhancing our pranic currents. So yes, let's talk more about pranayam.
It's funny that just before we jumped on to hit record, I'd been telling you that I've been sitting out in the sun. So it feels very, very relevant and pertinent, well timed to the conversation. And also something that just came to mind as you're speaking, particularly about the kosha, or the sheaths, the layers of self, and the pranamaya kosha specifically. This would be another conversation in itself, but it was an interesting observation. I recall back when I learned that the layers of self through a tantric lens is different to that Vedantic lens, where the sheath or the layer of prana is sort of slightly more internal with respect to the mind or the mental body, as in the layers of self in the Vedanta approach or philosophy. But, I think also too, when we look to the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, or Yoga Sutra as most people know it to be, and that classical definition of pranayama, and then there's differing explanations or descriptions in the Hatha yoga tradition. Is there anything that you could highlight there that might help to maybe offer some clarity, or even not even clarity, but just highlight a couple of differing insights around pranayama and what it is? Because I guess on one hand, I've had teachers say, well, true pranayama has kumbhaka, or true pranayama is a state of being, is without the cessation of breath, right? But then other teachers will suggest that it's the extension of life and life force, and relates to how many breaths that are offered to you in this life. So there's so many different applications or directions that we can come through, and I think they all hold value, no doubt. But is there anything that you would like to speak to with that variation across different traditions?
Of course. I think actually these the variations are to be celebrated, and it's wonderful that we have so many variations in this. And who knows, there may be many more that are yet to come in some way. Of course, let's begin first maybe by seeing what would be the approach or the historical approach to this, and that's from the Vedas. And from the Vedas, we don't have so much description about pranayam practices in particular. Of course, there's a lot about prana. In the Atharva Veda as well, they have the description about the joining of prana and apana, that is the two vayus, the joining of the breaths as a practice, but it doesn't say it's a pranayam practice. In another Upanishad, they describe about practicing breath retention, and while practicing breath retention, kumbhaka, to chant the Gayatri mantra. So the Gayatri mantra as a mantra recitation practice with breath hold is described. Again, they're not described as particularly pranayam practices, but described as practices. So maybe here is some inkling to where the later pranayamic traditions have also evolved from. Coming to the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali describes pranayam as shvasa parshvasayor gati vichhedaha pranayamaha. Shvasa and parshvasa. So that is the incoming and the outgoing breath. Gati vichheda, in the movement, in the gati of this breath, the movement of the incoming and outgoing breath, there is a vichheda. A vichheda here means a pause, or this can be a natural, spontaneous pause that occurs, or it can be a choice as well, self-induced. So changing the course of breath in that sense, according to Patanjali, becomes pranayam. So it can be after inhaling, or after exhaling, or during the process of inhaling, or during the process of exhaling. So this pause, this suspension of breath is pranayam. So from that context, yes, suspension, the vichhed is pranayam. Then we have, of course, the context from the Hatha yogic traditions as well. Before we move there, Patanjali then describes 4 types of pranayam. One which is bahya vritti, which is external breath retention, abhyantara vritti, internal breath retention, and stamba vritti, which is during the process of inhaling or exhaling, you make a pause. And then while one has become more proficient in these practices of pranayam, there occurs the 4th vritti, which is devoid of any kind of pause that one makes deliberately. And that is what maybe the Hatha yogic traditions refer to as the Kevala Kumbhaka. He just calls it the 4th type. And we practice these different types of pranayam to enter into the 4th, which is leading towards the state of samadhi. In Hatha yogic traditions, they describe a pranayam, or they don't call it pranayam as well sometimes. They refer to it as purely kumbhaka. So perhaps the primary aspect of pranayam now here refers to the suspension of breath, the holding of breath. But of course, the phases of pranayam, that is the puraka, the rechaka, inhalation and exhalation, are vital to the practice, but the importance or the most value is given to kumbhaka out here, the retention. And then they have different ratios, 1:1:2, 1:2:2, and then one progresses to 1:4:2. And sometimes they also, some texts will have 1:4:2:1. So they introduce a bahya vritti as well, external breath retention as well. But mostly they talk about internal breath retention in these Hatha Yogic traditions. We have different various types of pranayams that are also described. Nadi Shuddhi is a prerequisite to then practicing some of these pranayams, these kumbhakas. It's like a cleansing, anulom vilom, as it is more commonly called. Inhale through left, holding the breath, exhaling through right. Inhaling right, holding the breath, exhaling through left. This completes one cycle. The text described doing 20 such cycles and 4 times a day. Of course, now this is for one who is only practicing yoga, who's a yogi, a hatha yogi living in a hut, and the descriptions that are given in those texts. But for us, maybe having one round or one cycle of 20 rounds is very good in our modern day society, in the lives that we are living, to then receive the benefits, the mental, physiological benefits, and of course, prepare for deeper states of spiritual recognition. Later texts, and particularly in, I would say, the Shaivite texts, they describe a pranayam as not so much related to the breath, but related to the mind. So they would say that being in asana is actually, one becomes steady in asana when they are able to focus on the suspension of breath. And they say that is true asana. And then from that, when the mind gets absorbed into itself and begins to reflect on the true nature and begins to get established in that, that is pranayam. So pranayam is actually the inward movement of the mind. And this is also very interesting because the mind and prana are actually like two sides of the same coin. And the texts like the Hatha Pradipika describes this, the interrelation, the link between the mind and prana. Chale vate chalam chittam. Chale vate, as long as the vata, as long as the breath is in movement, as long as prana is in movement, chalam chittam, the chitta, the mind is also in movement. Nischale, nischalam bhavet. Nischala means without movement. So if you pause the breath or you pause the movement of prana, you will pause the movement of the mind as well. Yogi sthanutvam apnoti. The yogi attains sthanuhu. The yogi attains sthanutvam. The yogi attains stableness, steadiness. Sthanu actually in the Amara Kosha is very beautifully one of the names of Lord Shiva as well. So the yogi actually begins to recognize the true nature of oneself. Sthanutvam apnoti, tatoho vayum nirodhayet. Therefore, practice vayu nirodha, practice chitta nirodha, because vayu nirodha is chitta nirodha. Vayu vritti is chitta vritti. So it's the same. Chitta vritti nirodha yoga, prana vritti nirodha yoga. So in this sense, chitta and prana are so interlinked that if we control chitta vrittis, we have prana vritti controlled as well. If we control prana vritti, that's the movements of the breath, we have chitta vritti nirodha as well. So many various definitions, and so there's many more, of course, but just a few as we are discussing here.
And I feel that what you finished up with there is very easy to grasp and understand for most people, because even it's very evident, I think, in modern research and science, or contemporary research and science, about mental health and the effects of the breath on the mind and the effects of the mind on the breath. And we even just see this when we experience trauma or high stress states, literally what happens to the breath in response to what's happening to the mind. And even at the most surface level, in the most tangible, physical way, no doubt this is why so many people are drawn to the yoga practice, because it's the one opportunity they've found that they're actually giving time and attention to the quality of their breath and thereby the quality of their mind and their thoughts and their emotional state. And with, I suppose, with that in mind, the considerations of the landscape right now, I did want to ask you a little about your personal view, personally, but professionally as well, I suppose, on the current popularity and trend of breath work. And I think that breath work is no doubt anchored in the pranayama techniques and let's say tradition, if you will. But it's obviously not exactly the same. And I do, even through an Ayurvedic lens, I have a little personal concern with breath work because it's usually done in group settings, large group settings. And even the shastra speaks to certain pranayama as being, I mean, maybe, I don't know if dangerous would be the right word, but something to have a lot of caution around and to have really almost individualized guidance under the guru or the teacher. And I just find that it could be the way that it's being practiced. A lot of these breathwork sessions could be overstimulating. There's a lot more mouth breathing, which science shows has a different impact on the nervous system and the mind than nasal breathing. And yeah, so anyway, I would just really appreciate your personal perspective on that.
Of course. So, like you mentioned, that many of these practices have their roots in, yogic traditions or other deeper cultural connections from other traditions as well. And they have been modified. They have been, some variations have been brought into these practices. Of course, they still do in some way maintain some of the essences of these practices, but are also very much diluted. And that is a method, that is a point of concern for me as well. Primarily beginning with as you mentioned, mouth breathing. So if we just see the function of the mouth and the function of the nose, we understand that we have evolved as a species and we have evolved these parts of our body for particular functions. So the mouth particularly is for intake of food, water, communication, and the such. Of course, the teeth and things around it as well. And the nose is primarily for the function of breathing. Now, it so happens that both of these are connected, and one can also do the function of the nose through the mouth. But that is, of course, maybe, and I don't know, maybe science has a explanation for this, but, a backup mechanism if for some reason the nose is not functioning up to its capacity or effectively, then one has the ability to do the same function through the mouth. But primarily, the nose is for that reason. And a simple way to understand it also is that the function of the cilia, the hair-like structures in the nose that are there, and they're not just in the nose, but they run slightly into the back cavity, the nasal cavity as well. And its function is to warm the cool air that comes in from the environment, from outside. So generally the temperature of the air outside that we breathe in is slightly cooler than our normal body temperature. And the function of the hair there is to warm that air, because the lungs do not want cool air coming in. It's maybe, disadvantageous to it, maybe even harmful to it in some manner. So the nose, the function is to warm the cool air that comes in. And then, of course, we feel it. When we breathe out, we can feel this gentle, warm air coming out as well. So we understand here now that the function of the nose is to prepare the air in such a manner that it can nicely, the prana in such a manner that the lungs can then absorb the vital essence of it and then return what is not required by the body. Now, modern breathwork practices have shifted this to a lot of breathing through the mouth. And now we are taking in directly cool air through the mouth. And we are also maybe changing some of the movements. And I've seen in some practices, I've done them myself as well, some of them, to, experience and to know. And breathing much more into the abdominal region and having the abdomen protrude a lot, especially. So of course, that is enhancing diaphragmatic breathing, but it's not focusing on a full breath as well that one can take as we do in pranayama practices or simple yogic breathing exercises, where we're using, the different lobes of the lungs and the middle parts and especially the upper parts as well. So there is much change in modern breathwork practices as to what parts of the body are being used as well and what functions they are for. Definitely, one can still feel many benefits from these practices, as many of the students of these practices would do. But again, they're very fast paced, they're very hyperventilating oriented, and perhaps this is not an effective approach in a long term sense as well. So again, like you mentioned, it's a very personalized practice. Each person's there's a new study come out actually recently. Each one of us has a unique breath print. Like we have a fingerprint, each one has a unique breath print. So it's so subjective, what kind of breathing practices are going to suit what kind of person. And again, generalizing them, of course, that people can get some benefits, but it's such a unique practice to each person. So having that one-on-one connection is much more effective for someone's progress spiritually, or just to understand what their mind and body needs.
Yeah, I also would add that breathing through the nose, there's like an inbuilt filtration system, let's say, so it's cleaner and less impurities get into the body, and you're more likely to be healthy and well. But also, I guess it's more of a personal reflection. Is that we see a lot of yoga paired with breath work or yoga paired with TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and I think it's a indication that I think many students and teachers are unaware that yoga is quite whole and complete. We've already got this system of pranayama, and we've got the subtle yogic anatomy, and so there's certainly not. I'm not indicating that it's bad or wrong or there's any harm in that, but I feel like it's a real sign that practitioners and teachers are unaware or not getting access to this vast body of knowledge beyond the body, and so we are kind of defaulting to pairing it with other systems that are outside sort of the yogic context, if you will. And yeah, and I think that if you can see that, it's an invitation into, well, where can I go to actually learn more, not just intellectually, but directly through experience through pranayama, which is beautiful because I know that that's offered very much through the Yoga Education College and the work that you're doing. So perhaps that's a good moment to give that a plug and direct people to the regular courses and trainings and classes with the Yoga Education College, because there's not a lot out there, especially with teachers such as yourself and Eddie and Robertji, that have this really long-term experience. I wanted to ask you as well, just quickly here, if you have any guidance for those listening in for developing more challenging aspects of pranayama. So, for example, what comes to mind, something that I learned that I find helps is, with breath retentions, to swallow when you're pausing the breath. It's almost like it gives the mind something to do, because people can kind of, I think, feel a little bit of panic, even if they're holding the breath ever so briefly. I know that here in Australia, Simon Borg-Olivier, who's a senior teacher here of many, many years and has done a lot of scientific research as well into breathing, that's something he recommends. And also Shandor and Emma from Shadow Yoga, the swallowing on breath retention. So is there any guidance, maybe developing the exhalation or breath retentions, or something that you personally have found is beneficial to those immersed in pranayama and maybe facing some difficulties or challenges?
Of course, I think the swallowing part of it is very much vital. It's actually very good as a free diver, beginner free diver as well. This happens when I do have to breathe through my mouth before I go down. So I'm not saying that I don't use my mouth to breathe, but it's particularly according to the situation. And, maybe this can come up because we do have some yogic techniques that also use inhalation through the mouth, but very specific practices. And again, they're controlled, their exhalation is through the nose, etc. But over here in this context about increasing the breath capacity, particularly the exhalation as well, I think you also mentioned this about chanting mantras. So chanting mantras are very useful for developing one's pranic flow as well, and especially the exhalation, because all the chanting is done on an exhalation. So, maybe having some little slightly longer chants and practicing those before maybe going for pranayama practices can be very useful as well. Another few practices that can help is, so when we hold the breath after exhalation, that helps us to develop our capacity to exhale as well. So if we suppose we have an exhalation of say 8 counts and we want to maybe increase it to 10 counts. So maybe practicing exhalation for 8 counts, a few rounds, and then practicing exhalation for 8 counts and pausing after for 2 or 3 counts, and then doing that a few times and then trying to exhale for 9 counts. And perhaps that will, not perhaps, I think that will help to increase the lengthening of the exhalation. Similarly, if one is looking to increase the lengthening of their inhalation, maybe perhaps one is inhaling for 4 counts and they want to make it 5 or 6 counts. Inhale, hold the breath for 2 counts or 3 counts, and then do that for a few rounds, and then try inhaling for 5 counts. And in this manner, one can then proceed to lengthening their inhalation or exhalation depending upon, what they're looking for. Other practices that can help, I think these are 2 simple tools. Again, we don't need a lot. We just need the simple tools and we need to practice them. So practicing these tools will really, help change the flow of breath.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I hadn't really considered that the kumbhaka, the breath retention, as being an aid to developing both the inhalation and exhalation. And yes, I did literally, I think it was yesterday, post on social media about using mantra as a tool to develop exhalation. And I think that it's helpful because in one sense, there's many reasons why, but in one sense, it gives the mind something to pay attention to. That recitation of mantra, in my experience with students, often the challenges arise because it's more of a mental thing. It's a sense of panic, or not necessarily a panic, but just a discomfort. I'm uncomfortable feeling like I can't breathe. And so when we have something like mantra, which quite literally, it does help to develop the exhalation in a more physical, practical sense, but mentally as well. It's that aid, that tool, to just keep the mind steady and quiet. But also for those interested in mantra, it's assisting us in the cultivation of developing our capacity for reciting longer mantras. You see the priests at temples in India just reciting aloud just for, hours literally on end, and there's just so much power there, which
The
is
discomfort you
inspiring.
just mentioned also is actually is described in the yogic text. Swami Hariharanand describes this as the udghata, as an opening. So, when that opening comes, it's an opening of the discomfort, and the discomfort arises, and we can stay with that discomfort in the breath retention. He says up to 2 openings, practically speaking. In the beginning, maybe just 1, or you feel a sense of discomfort and you feel, okay, I need to let go of my breath or I need to inhale. So continue with that. But he says with time, you can develop getting comfortable with the discomfort and maybe waiting for the second udghata, the second opening. So you felt the discomfort once, and then you reassure yourself. That's why the teacher is so important also in the pranayama practices. And it says also in the text, Guru Upadishta Margena, means you must practice according to your teacher's instructions, that when you do pranayama. So with the first udghata, you can sit with that and be reassured by your teacher, by yourself later, that it's okay. And then when the second discomfort comes, the second udghata, then you attend to it and then you inhale or you exhale accordingly. So again, it's about becoming a little bit more comfortable with that uneasy feeling that arises during Kumbhaka, and with time, this also begins to melt away.
That's helpful. Thank you. And it really highlights that yoga is, if you're dedicated for a lifelong path of practice, it's not always comfortable. In fact, yoga brings up discomfort, and that's where the maturation or the opportunity for maturation is available to us to lean into. Because I think quite often we, let's say, embellish yoga with these ideas that it's all about love and bliss and, serenity and stillness and all that sort of stuff, but there's a lot of discomfort as we grow and develop on the path, and that's such a gift to us all. Harsh, is there anything that you would like to close with? I feel like we've given the listener so much incredible information and insight, so thank you. Is there any closing words that you would like to share?
Yes, thank you so much, Amy. It's been a pleasure here. Of course, this is the second time we're doing this, and looking forward to many more as well, hopefully. Just wanted to close with speaking about Yoga Education College, and Robert, Eddie, myself, were into preserving these traditions, of course, in the modern context, with keeping up with scientific studies on yoga. We're offering trainings in pranayama, in asana as well. Our focus is mostly on the pranayama trainings. So we have like short 1 month, 6 week courses over 2 or 3 times a year, and everyone is welcome. It's very simple introductory level practices, and really we're just here to share the love for yoga and get people to breathe better. Yes.
Wonderful. Yes. I mean, there's, for anyone that's listening that's a yoga teacher, there is specifically the pranayama teacher training that you guys offer. But for those that aren't teachers, there's beginner, intermediate, and advanced pranayama classes and so forth. And so many other things as well. I've had a great blessing of studying Sukshma Vyayama with Robert, and puja with both Robert and Eddie, and everything that they do is just so rich. And I very much appreciate that it's anchored in so much wisdom and depth, and in addition, as you touched on, supported by science, which makes it even more fascinating and affirming for sure. For anyone that would like to stay in touch with Harsh, you can find him over on Instagram at Yogatman, so YOGATMAN. That'll be in the show notes for you. And also you can just go to the yogaeducationcollege.com website to check out all the courses. I do recommend subscribing because you'll get email updates with what's happening on a regular basis, which is great. Thank you so much again, Harsh. It is such a delight, a treat to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much.
If this episode was of value to you and your life, please subscribe. And if you can think of someone who would benefit from this dialogue, please do them a favor and send it their way. If you feel called, hop on over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review. This is the best way to get these conversations into the ears and hearts of our wider community, to those who need it most. You can find me at amyelandry.com or over on Instagram at amyelandry. May we all move a little closer to a life living in alignment.